Well, in that case, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for this meeting to hear from John Howell, OBE MP, about the work of the Council of Europe and the European Convention on Human Rights, both of which are topical. Now, first introduction. The meeting is on the record, so please bear in mind that if you say something, it is potentially broadcast and can be accessed. We'll be using the usual meeting format, which we have. Please make sure your microphones are muted during the course of the presentation by John, and also thereafter, except if you're called on to ask a question, because otherwise we get feedback and it starts to become very difficult. Please use speaker view for a better experience. That's something Simon tells me, and I'm sure he's right. For those of you who want to ask a question when John has finished his presentation, then in those circumstances, would you either put something into the chat indicating that you want to ask a question and it will be noted, or alternatively, just put your hand up and we will try to make sure we get to you. And Simon Saunders, who is on and is always in charge of the tech, I think we'll be able to handle it, and then I will ask and call on you to ask a question. Now, great pleasure this evening to introduce John Howell, MP for the Henley constituency since June 2008, when his predecessor went off to do other things, like becoming Mayor of London. And since being elected, John has held several positions both in Parliament and representing the United Kingdom internationally. That includes being PPS, Parliamentary Private Secretary for a number of departments, the Prime Minister's Trade Envoy to Nigeria, a member of the Justice Select Committee, Chairman of the Industry and Parliament Trust, and most recently, he has been appointed the leader of the United Kingdom delegation to the Council of Europe. And he's now, in fact, a vice president of the council, so he on occasion chairs it and acting as deputy speaker equivalent for the Parliamentary Assembly, and he has to do that both in English and in French, and he is capable of doing it in French as well as English. And the reason for that is that, as well as having had a lengthy business career, not your usual politico, whom we sometimes get to come and speak to us, spanning a range of activities. He's been a tax inspector with the Inland Revenue, a partner in Ernst & Young, reporter for BBC World Service, and setting up his own media production company, including, when he was at Ernst & Young, playing an important and influential role on moving business to Central and Eastern Europe towards democracy and market economies. And it was for that he was awarded, not for political activities with a small p, but not with a big P, that he got his OBE in 2000, long before he came into Parliament. But in addition to that, the French, as I've just ascertained, he learnt whilst studying archaeology, and particularly studying the archaeology of Neolithic northern France. And he is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. John, you are most welcome. And we look forward to your speaking to us for however really long you want. And then after that, we will have a conversation. Over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I hope none of you are going to ask your questions in French, because that would really test me. But let me say, I've just got back recently from a trip to The Hague. And I mention this because part of the reason for doing that was to go to attend a standing committee of the Council of Europe. But part of it was also to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Congress of The Hague. And we started off that celebration with a Pathé news clip of Winston Churchill, who was president of the Congress, giving a fulsome speech in which there was absolutely no doubt of his multilateral credentials and his multilateral beliefs. And at the end of the session, we were shown another Pathé news clip. And this was of Churchill finishing his speech and sitting down. And the 750 people who were there led by the Dutch royal family, no less, leapt to their feet to say how wonderful this was and to give him a standing ovation. Now, I mention this because I think it's important for two reasons. Firstly, it's because the Council of Europe represents the last multilateral opportunity in Europe for us to show that same spirit across Europe. And here we're talking of a Europe of 46 countries rather than a Europe of 27 countries. And the second reason is it shows how involved the Conservative Party was in setting up everything that came out of the Congress of The Hague, including the Council of Europe. Now, the Council of Europe exists to be able to look after human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And it does so on the basis of individual conventions. And you might ask me to name one convention that has made a big impact on the UK. And the convention that I would mention in this context is the Istanbul Convention, which was set up to protect women and girls from domestic violence. And we've just had a very big Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is known as PACE, if I go into lingo at any point. We just had that here in London to celebrate the fact that in the summer, after a lot of hard work, we ratified the Istanbul Convention. It's 15 years late that we ratified it, but we ratified it all the same. And I'll come back to some of those areas, and I can come back to them in questions. But I think the thing that I would stress most of all is that it is the last opportunity that we have in Europe to show how important the soft power that we can use is and how effective we are at using it. And let me give you a number of examples of the way in which we have been using it. First of all, I personally was the first and indeed so far the only person from Western Europe to go to see a Turkish political prisoner, Osman Kavala, who's a businessman and a philanthropist, and he's one of Erdogan's enemies in that he could have stood for the presidency. And in going over to see him, he's been 6.5 years in pre-trial detention there, and there was no resentment on his part at all. It was like going for tea with your favorite uncle. And we got through a tremendous amount of information, despite the fact that we were being filmed and recorded all the time. A second example of this also involves Turkey, but it is the pressure that we as a delegation have put on the Turkish delegation to go back and to convince Erdogan that he should allow Finland and Sweden into NATO. And I think that that is a very fundamental point. And a third example of this is Kosovo, where I, again, am personally leading the Council of Europe to admit Kosovo as a full member of the Council of Europe. And it's a great shame that is being held up at the moment, but I'm absolutely conscious of trying to get that through. And another example of this is the term that I use of ecocide, which is rejected by the British government, but that would example allow people to take, for example, Russian generals who destroy a Ukrainian village by destroying the environment to a tribunal to be held against it. But the UK government may be saying no to this, but the Icelandic government, who has the presidency of the council, is saying yes to it. And the final thing that I would say is, as an example of this, is Russia. Russia used to be a member of the Council of Europe, but I was the person that put in the first letter to the Secretary General demanding that we kick Russia out. And as a result of that, we have kicked Russia out, and I'm very pleased to be able to do that. Now, we have two organizations in Europe. There is the Council of Europe and there is the European Union. And it's confused by the fact that the European Union stole the flag of the Council of Europe and stole the anthem. And as you can imagine, relations are not of their warmest, particularly over human rights. I am all for the same human rights system applying across Europe, but we already have every member of the European Union as a member of the Court of Human Rights and having signed the convention. So there is quite a lot to be able to discuss here. So that's broadly what the Council of Europe does, and what I, as a leader, and I've been leader for 3 years, I think now, does. It's a delegation of 36 members. Half are what you might call full-time members and half are substitutes, so that we always have a large delegation there. Human rights and the European Court of Human Rights. I am a great supporter of the European Court of Human Rights, and we have an excellent judge there who, sadly, since one of the things about the judges there is that we elect them. They're not just appointed by governments; they are elected by the members of the Parliamentary Assembly. And I remember electing our current judge, Tim Ike, KC, to his position, and he's now almost coming to an end of that position. But that is and if you can get him to come and speak to you, he is very good value. There is an organization that the council runs called the Venice Commission, and the Venice Commission consists of lawyers one of whose primary roles is to decide whether draft legislation complies with the convention. And I have been trying my hardest to get the recent draft illegal immigration bill, getting agreement to that, to be sent to the Venice Commission. I've raised this directly with the Prime Minister, I've raised it with his Chief of Staff, and I've raised it with the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General is taking it seriously and is trying to push it forward. But you may ask why I voted for the illegal immigration bill. It's because of the assurances that I was given about the Venice Commission, and that we were likely to look at that opportunity seriously. But we still have the third reading, at which I have said that I'm holding my counsel until we've seen what that is like. It's one of the important things to remember, above all, is that the European Court of Human Rights is not a foreign court. It is an international tribunal. And as I said, we do have a judge there, and a very good judge too. Now, when we last held the presidency of the Council of Europe, which was in Dominic's time as Attorney General, back when David Cameron was in coalition government, we introduced something called the Brighton Declaration. And if I can quote Dominic himself on this, what it says is that the responsibility for guaranteeing human rights rests with the government, parliament, and courts of a country. It sets out clearly that the court should not routinely overturn the decisions made by national authorities. So one of the big tasks that we have is to make sure that that is implemented as much as we possibly can. And that shows that the relationship between the UK government and the court, and indeed between all governments and the court, is an evolutionary one. And one that we are involved in taking forward. There's just one final point that I would make on this before we have questions and discussion. At the moment, right across Europe, we have extreme right-wing parties coming to power. We also have a war in Ukraine. There has never been a bigger need for the Convention on Human Rights and for the court. And that is one of the principal reasons why I support it. And it is not a question of us wanting to be like New Zealand or Australia. They are not members of the European Court. This is a question of us staying as a member of something that we have already joined and helped write the description of it, the constitution of it, and it is something that I am desperately proud of. As one example, just to finish on, when chairing a session of the Council of Europe, when the Russians were still in, I had an opportunity to involve a Russian in a discussion, and then he had the opportunity to reply a bit later. And we went to a Ukrainian in between. And when we came back to him, there he was, slumped in his chair, snoring away, having had far too much vodka for lunch. And everyone started to laugh. And although I tried to keep a straight face in this, I started to laugh as well. And that woke him up, and he just blustered away for a few minutes until I actually shut him up and closed the thing down. So you never know what you're going to get at the Council of Europe, and you have to have your wits about you. And it certainly helps if you can keep a straight face with that sort of activity going on. That is probably about my 10 minutes or so, and it's open to questions. You're muted, Dominic.
I am, yes, John. Thank you very much for that. And you won't be surprised to hear that so much of what you said was, as far as I was concerned, very good news. And I was just going to usurp the chair's function because, as you know, the ECHR and my career are rather heavily intertwined. It certainly brought my career as Attorney General to an end because that is the reason why David Cameron dispensed with my services. And obviously I was reassured to hear the Prime Minister's comments about trying to enact a piece of legislation, and everybody has sympathy with the government's problems over immigration, which is compatible with our human rights obligations. And I know that the Attorney General almost thinks likewise. But what are we going to do about, I don't know how many there are, 40, 50 of your colleagues in the House of Commons who seem to have an absolute obsessional fixation on it? I sometimes wonder if they actually understand what it's really about, but seem to think that in some way, by getting rid of it, it's the solution to all life's problems. And I just wondered if you could share your thoughts on this, because it does strike me as being one of the stranger aspects of where we are today.
Well, I think there are a number of points on that. Firstly, I am not going to speak for 40 or 50 idiots within the Conservative Party, and they are idiots, starting at the top or near the top and working down. It is, I think, a fundamental part of our ability to look after ourselves, because we benefit as much from the European Court as does anyone else. But I would just point out to those that say it is interfering so much in our activities, the number of cases that has been against the UK that have been heard at the European Court of Human Rights since the Brighton Declaration in 2012 amounts to 4 a year. That's all. And it is still running at about that level. And that's partly because the UK judicial system is so strong, whereas in many other countries it is not. But it just shows that it cannot have any influence on us. That I think you're right that those people who try to oppose it simply don't know what it's about. And there are some people who said to me that now that we've done Brexit, we're coming after the European Court of Human Rights. For heaven's sake, they need to distinguish what is there. They need to see the benefit that our involvement in the Council of Europe brings to the UK, because if we leave the European Court of Human Rights, we have to leave the Council of Europe as well. So that is a rather long answer to your otherwise pithy question, Dominic, but it is something that I feel very passionate about. You're still muted.
That's better. Now, who would like to ask questions? Please don't be shy. Please put your hand up on the hand function. Robert Morland wants to ask a question. So Robert, if you get unmuted, you can go ahead. And then we have Mark Bolliott next. Robert first. Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for that. Indeed, I happen to be a member of my Conservative Association executive, and we discussed the whole subject of the votes, etc., with the Member of Parliament, who's Richard Graham, who appeared to be actually very optimistic on the Attorney General's discussions with the Court of Human Rights. I can say that without breaking the confidence of the meeting, because he also said it on a news night. Do you hold that optimism? Are you pretty sure that we're going to find that the whole issue in relation to what we're planning to be all right? But could I also ask you quite a separate question? You mentioned Kosovo and your own action. I would have thought Kosovo is going to be very difficult in getting agreement on. I mean, first of all, there are four member states of the EU who oppose the recognition of Kosovo. And, is Kosovo really a stable state? I entirely sympathize with Kosovo rather than obviously Serbia, etc., etc. But are you quite so happy about it?
Can I deal with the second question first? I am very happy with Kosovo. I've met people from the top right down from Kosovo. The difficulty for Kosovo is Serbia, and Serbia, of course, is has been, and I think still is, despite the efforts of the EU, is still a Russian satellite. And it is very difficult to try and get some movement on that, but we have got movement on it. Kosovo has a position in the Council of Europe where it can attend and participate in debates. It cannot vote in those debates. So they do participate. They participate very fully, and they participate very sensibly. If you want to see them in action, then at the next plenary assembly, they will no doubt be there, and that's in April. And you're welcome to join us to make your own judgment on that. To answer your question about whether I am optimistic, yes, I am optimistic, and that was why I voted for the bill and to support the Prime Minister, to be honest, because I think he is a very good Prime Minister and he's doing a very good job. But if you look at the papers that were produced in that, they make it absolutely clear that we believe that all of this, all of what he is trying to achieve, can be accomplished by staying as part of the ECHR. And I think a reference to the Venice Commission, which I personally have used in relation to the Turkish parliamentary legislation on how they are handling the new legislation that they brought in ahead of the elections there, which was turned around in about a month, so not a very long time at all, is a really good sign for optimism.
Thank you. Mark, I think you were the next person whose hand went up. Mark Bolliott.
Thank you, Dominic. An easy and a difficult question. The easy one, attitude of the Labour Party. More difficult one, when I was heavily involved in the Brexit debate, one of the reasons cited in my golf club for leaving was the European Court of Human Rights. So there's a much wider issue with the public about an understanding of the importance of the Court and the Council of Europe. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can. Let me comment on the first of those questions, the attitude of the Labour Party. My delegation to the Council of Europe is a cross-party delegation. It has a number of Labour Party members, including Jeremy Corbyn, and it has 2 SNP members on as well. And I can tell you, you would find it very difficult to get a cigarette paper between any of us. And when we meet, there is unanimity in our views, and there is unanimity in our views on this issue. And let me turn to your second question. I think you're absolutely right. There is an issue with the public. It is not just about the court, although that is the tip of the iceberg now. It is about the Council of Europe as well. And I've made it my mission in taking on this role to increase knowledge of the Council of Europe amongst the public, amongst civil servants, and particularly amongst politicians. You perhaps won't believe it, but there have been debates that I've spoken at and have raised various issues around conventions that the council has signed and brought into effect, where the minister and the civil servants have known nothing about them at all. So I'm really, excuse me, conscious of the task that is ahead of us all the time in making sure that what we do is better known, and that includes the court.
Thank you. Oliver, next, and then we'll take Lynn Faulkner, then Cherry Miller, then John Boyce. And I think there's also Peter has put in a question. So Oliver first. You're muted.
Can't hear you.
No, still muted. Try again. If not, we will go to Lynn and we'll come back to you. I promise, when you've sorted out your. I think Oliver, we'll bypass you for the moment, but I promise to come back. Lynn.
Thank you, Dominic. I'd like to thank you, John, for a very informative talk. You know, you packed a lot in. I did once hear a talk from a lawyer who'd been to the Court of Human Rights, and it's my understanding, we did say that there's only a tiny number of UK cases each year. I believe most of the cases involve countries which blatantly ignore human rights, like Russia, guess what, who don't give their prisoners the right to have a lawyer, and the Turks, who have oppressed the Kurds, and I'm sure there's lots of other examples. Also, we forget that this court was created by a British MP. So it was our idea in the first place, as I understand it. How can we educate the public and the headbanger ERG MPs about the true role of the court, and also the importance of the Council of Europe, which I think does it have 47 European countries? Far more than the number 46. In the EU.
46 now. We kicked Russia out.
Okay, well, 46 is a lot more than the 27 in the European Union. So the Council of Europe is actually the genuine European body. And and it would be a disaster, wouldn't it, if we had to give up our membership of that just because a few people haven't got an understanding of what the court's about. So I wonder if you've got any ideas. I'm sure you've tried your best with some of your colleagues, but we actually need someone to spell out the facts a bit more, don't we?
Well, let me deal with the first part of your question. The countries that have the largest number of cases before the European Court of Human Rights are Russia, which is no longer a member of the Council of Europe, and therefore it no longer has a judge at the Council of Europe, Turkey and Romania. And those are by far the biggest cases there.
You're going to do now.
Sorry?
So now, ma'am, yeah, we'll help you.
Hang on, somebody is not muted. Please mute if you're not asking a question.
Am I audible?
Yeah, oh, fine, John. It's just
Okay,
somebody
okay.
hasn't muted, so that we're hearing a private conversation at home.
Okay, so it's Russia, Turkey, and Romania that are there. In terms of educating the public, I try. I mean, I don't take this as a personal comment to me, but you know, I try my best to do this. I tried to have a briefing with lobby journalists here in the House of Commons before each plenary session of the Parliamentary Assembly. And on the first occasion when I tried this, I had about 10 turn up. I then, on the second occasion, I had 2 turn up. And then after that, nobody at all has turned up. So the biggest problem in educating the public is the attitude of papers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, who are so against the court and what it is trying to achieve. I do not understand fully why they are against it. But if you look at some of the television channels, like GB News, for example, that too has always been against it. But here in the House of Commons, let me just tell you briefly what I do. After each plenary session, which goes on for an entire week, I produce a summary of all of the papers that are there. They have my idiosyncratic style to them, unfortunately. But I also take pictures of the people who are speaking there. So it's genuinely cross-party. And we send that round to every MP and to not quite to every peer, but to most peers. And the increase in knowledge amongst them of what the council is doing is phenomenal. And this has been 3 years of drip feeding this through and of having huge numbers of debates here in Westminster Hall as the second chamber for the House of Commons to be able to get these points across. And I think, to be honest, until we can find a way to crack the newspapers, it's going to be a very difficult task.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, John. Cherry Miller, next.
Hello, and thank you, John, for a really interesting presentation. I'm from the University of Glasgow. I've recently come off a big project about the political groups of the European Parliament, but I'm really unfamiliar with the Council of Europe. And you mentioned that you go in a cross-party delegation, but is it the same as the European Parliament? Do you sit in your political group? And if so, what are your opportunities for building relationships with members of your political group? Because you're only there for like a week every month. Whereas I guess when we were in the European Parliament, there would be more opportunities. And is there similar dynamics in the Council of Europe with the EPP? Because obviously the Conservatives in the European Parliament had kind of alienated themselves from the EPP. And is there similar dynamics in the Council of Europe? But thank you, that was really interesting.
Okay, I mean that is an interesting question. There are some similarities with the European Parliament, and there are quite a lot of differences. The first difference that I would say is the EPP are a ramshackle bunch of people. They do not know who they really are. They say that they are not centre or right of centre. They say that they are left of centre. And that it makes it very difficult for us to link with them. We don't sit in our political groups within the Council of Europe. We sit alphabetically, which actually makes it much easier to have genuine debate and genuine discussion. There is an issue which I'm very happy to raise between the Conservative Party has an alliance of sorts with something called the Democratic Alliance. And the Democratic Alliance consists of a number of parties around Europe who I'm sure that many of you, and indeed me as well, would regard as fascist or near-fascist. It is fine to have an alliance with them on voting, but I have insisted, as leader of the UK delegation, I've insisted that we are two separate groups, and we come together to decide how we're going to vote against a massively left-wing grouping of people there. Don't forget that there are former communists in the Council of Europe as well. But I'm afraid the EPP is not a sensible alternative for us to be able to pursue any sort of relationship.
Thank you. John Oris.
Yes, thank you, Dominic, and thank you, John. In fact, I'm on the same track as Cherry just now, and concerned that if one belongs to an organisation like the Council of Europe or United Nations or wherever, one of the potential benefits is that we can find common cause with parties and countries on which we have a common interest in pursuing an issue. And certainly I know we were concerned some years ago when our delegation from the Conservative side to the Council of Europe was seen to be in the same group as the Russians, and that made us raise eyebrows as to what the potential was for finding this common ground. And I just wonder, given what you've just been saying both about the cigarette paper between you and Jeremy Corbyn, but also on your thoughts about the EPP, and that what you're describing is not the sort of EPP that we knew in the European Parliament, because there we did have a centre-right common ground, if you like, even if there were differences on some subjects. And I wonder if you could describe to us how you have used the position that you have there and the alliances that you can build up to push forward policies that we would want to see.
Well, let me start by saying that over the past, God knows how many years, but a large number of years, the leadership of the Conservative Party in the Council of Europe as a whole has taken an adversarial approach to the Council of Europe, and I don't think that has helped. I really don't think that has gone down very well. There is a feeling that everyone hates us, and that leads into some very questionable actions there. To a certain extent, to the extent that I've been able to do it, I've changed that. I believe in working together with people, and in my role, particularly as a vice president of the council, I try to work with people and get on with people. And so I will happily sit down with the leader of the EPP there, who is Polish, by the way, and with some of the others to be able to get on. It so happens that the president is a former communist from the Netherlands. And actually, I get on very, very well with him. We always find things to be able to do together and to work together in trying to take them forward. The Russians were a major problem. They weren't members of groups by nature. They merely assigned members to political groups so that they could know what was going on. And unfortunately, that all took place before I joined. I'm glad that I haven't had to face that in the time that I've been there, because that would have been a very difficult situation. But it was British Conservatives, and I say this with a great deal of pride. It was British Conservatives who have always stood against the Russians for their action in Ukraine. We stood against them in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, and we have stood against them and had them kicked out now. And I am very proud of that. I'm very proud to see that the plenary assembly and the Committee of Ministers, which is a sort of second chamber of the council, totally agreed on that approach. So there is a lot of cross-party working that is taking place there right across the council.
Thank you. Now, I'm terribly sorry about that. My server went down halfway through that answer. So I'm afraid not only did I miss a bit of it, but also I seem to have lost the chat. Now, there was Oliver who had a question. Oliver, if you'd like to have a go at putting your question now, please do. And then there was Peter, who also had a question, which I saw up on the chat, which currently I can't see. But let's start with Oliver.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant! Fantastic technology right there. I'm in a bar in a hotel. I'm on the hotel Wi-Fi, so amazed. Technology is great. Okay, thank you. Right, two questions. So, I think many points. The first question is covered already. So it's actually about Russia and its approach to ECHR. I mean, would you agree? I mean, I see. You know, Russia sees itself very much as an exception. So I don't know if it's a kind of well-known term, but you've heard of British exceptionalism. Would you see that there's Russian exceptionalism in terms of distancing itself or feeling it's separate from ECHR? Do you see that changing now into the future? Second question is, what do you think can be done, if anything, to help normalize in British politics acceptance of ECHR to get back to how we were pre-Brexit?
Well, if I can answer the second of those questions first, and then I'll have to come back to you to ask to get you to repeat your first question. The second question of what we can do is a very difficult one, because although the court may only have 4 cases before it, those 4 cases can be quite important. For example, one of the cases in the past that was before it was prisoner voting, and that was a case I think, Dominic, that you probably dealt with. You smile. I take that as a yes. The difficulty with that is that every time one of those cases comes up, the press in the UK makes a meal out of it. They don't see it as an opportunity for discussion between ourselves and the court to be able to take things forward. And I have tried very hard to get these points across, but I don't believe that the press are interested at all in taking a reasonable attitude towards the European Court of Human Rights. They still see it as an EU court, despite the fact that we point that out to them all the time, that it's not an EU court, it's an independent and international tribunal. But it is very difficult to get that over. In relation to there was a point that you raised about the Russians, wasn't there? Would you mind just repeating that?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Oh, we've lost you.
Okay, is that okay?
Oh yeah, that's brilliant.
Right. Would you agree that Russia sees itself as separate from Western European notions of human rights in general? Russian exceptionism, I'd call it.
Oh, right. Okay.
Go on, sorry.
Okay. Yes and no. There were some cases where Russia did accept the judgment of the court. But the fact that Russia came top of the list of people who had cases being brought against it in the court showed that it wasn't really serious about it. And I'm not sure how you deal with that. In fact, I'm not sure that I can deal with it at all at the Council of Europe. But you're absolutely right that Russia did have exceptions. It did play an exceptionist card in being able to deal with the court. Does that answer all your questions?
I think
Thank
that
you.
probably does. Thank you.
Okay.
And if I might just add, yes, you're absolutely right, John. I did have quite a lot to do with prisoner voting because it dogged my time as Attorney General. I actually went over to argue another case in Strasbourg, which might provide some clarification. The interesting irony about prisoner voting, you're so right. I happen to think the court probably got that decision wrong when it made it. It came at a time when the court was perhaps a bit of micromanaging before the Brighton Declaration and very worried about Eastern European countries backsliding on human rights. But the irony is that once we'd had the Brighton Declaration and a lot of the huffing and puffing ceased, and remember Theresa May made quite clear she wasn't going to interfere with our status as members of the Council of Europe and an adherent to the European Convention, David Lidington was then able to resolve it in a way which required not even a piece of primary legislation, and nobody has talked about since, which just goes to show how exaggerated some of this press response is to this type of case.
I think that goes back to one of the earlier questions. You don't get anywhere by always taking an adversarial approach with the court or with the council. You have to work with them. And in relation to Turkey, when I went to see Kavala, I'm also the rapporteur for Turkey. I've actually had a meeting with the Committee of Ministers, the second chamber of the council. I'm not sure that many members of the Assembly have ever done that. And I sat down with them and I said, you know, you are all diplomats and I'm a politician. But there are times when we both have to work from the same hymn sheet and we both have to sing the same hymns. And this is one of them. And if you want to have a go at Turkey, you have to include me in that because, you know, I'm there a lot of the time on behalf of the council, and we cannot see it as a divided institution.
Thank you, John. Peter, I think you had a question. I see you need to unmute if you're going to ask it.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. Just done it. Thank you, Dominic. John, probably a very ignorant question, forgive me, but both these organisations have the word Europe in them, the council and the court. Is it the case that that they wish to expand membership well outside? Would they take members from any country in the world, for example? First question. And do you think the word Europe in both these organisations is helpful or appropriate now? Thank you.
Well, I mean, that is a fascinating question. Let us remember that the Council of Europe started before the EU. And so it is perfectly entitled to call itself the Council of Europe. And as I said at the beginning, that is a Europe of 46 member countries. But you're absolutely right. The thing that makes it very, very difficult to sell and to have a discussion with anyone about is the word Europe within that, because everybody sees Europe as being just the EU, and that Europe outside of the EU simply doesn't exist for them. So they completely see it as that's why they see it as an EU organization. And I'm always trying to overcome that by pointing out that it is independent. And the second question was I've forgotten. Peter, would you mind just repeating that?
Well, it was just the same thing, really. You know, is the council open to other countries
Oh, yeah.
joining? Is there any? Why
Yeah.
can't Canada, Brazil, Uruguay? I mean, anybody with the same culture who subscribes to the same values, surely would. You know.
Well, actually, it's funny you should say that, because I read a description in the equivalent of a barrister's journal in Australia, in which they were saying the European Convention on Human Rights is an absolutely brilliant thing, and if we can't join it, then we should adopt something similar to it. So, you know, I do think there is a role for that. It is a very Europe focused. I mean, it came out in 1948, and beyond that, it does take in countries like Israel, like Palestine, like some of the North African countries as partners in democracy. And they too can participate in debates but can't vote. And it is very useful to have them there. As I said right at the beginning when I first joined it, this is the only organization apart from the UN, that I've been to that has both Israel and the Palestinians sitting next to each other at the back of the plenary assembly, and nobody has done anything to try and broker a peace deal between them. When you've got representatives, parliamentary representatives there to be able to get on with it, it is something that I think we should be doing.
Indeed.
Thank you, John. There's a question from Gunther Fellinger. Gunther?
Yes, thanks a lot. This is Günther Fellinger from the Austrian NATO committee. My question is from a car actually on the Romanian-Bulgarian border, because I'm campaigning for Schengen. So sorry, I'm a bit dark here. But my question is about this historic visit which President Zelensky made recently to the United Kingdom. And it was really amazing. And you are supporting Ukraine so much in the fight for freedom. And now suddenly this big campaign against the UK membership in the Council of Europe is coming up. Don't you suppose that, or do you have any indication there is massive Russian intervention in this campaign happening? And is there any kind of indication in that?
I've no evidence at all that there is Russian intervention against any of us at all on that. And in fact, I mean, I was due to go to Ukraine myself recently, but unfortunately, I went down with COVID the day before I was about to go, so I had to postpone that. But the only suggestion that Russia was involved is in Strasbourg, where the Council of Europe is based. And that comes about because before I went on my first ever trip, I was taken aside by MI6 and said, you better watch out, because the Russians are there and they will be using it to tap your phone. And they have a huge embassy there, far bigger than they need for Strasbourg. And I went to Strasbourg, for heaven's sake, you know, it's part of Europe, it's the central part of Europe. And I got off the train, and within 5 minutes of getting off the train, my phone had been hacked. Now, you can draw your own conclusions from that, but I certainly believed it was the Russians that were doing that. And I think that it is a very sad indication of the way that the Russians played the system.
Thank you, John. Now, Asia Odriozola.
Dominic, thank you. That's excellent pronunciation. So congratulations on that. So, John, I was just wondering, what's your view on the recent US ambassador remarks about to Hungary's Viktor Orban to pivot away from Russia? And as well, what's your view about the increasingly likely demise of Erdogan in Turkey's elections in 2 months' time, and its possible impact on the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine when he's gone?
Let me deal with the Turkish situation. The polls that I've seen in Turkey suggests that Erdogan will either lose the presidential election or a parliamentary election. It's unlikely that he will lose both, although the earthquake may have changed the views of people on that. But before the earthquake, it was likely that he would lose one or the other. And from the perspective of the work that I've been doing in trying to get Osman Kavala free, that is good news, because it means that there is probably a deal to be done, and this is what I've been working on. Because in my non-parliamentary life, I am a mediator, and it's those skills that I've been able to bring to this. So I do think that there are a huge number of opportunities to be able to go forward if Erdogan loses either of those elections. And I think that another of those is the role that he will play in NATO, or that the country will play in NATO, and whether it will calm down a bit in its opposition to many other NATO countries and the sanctions regime, and being able to take that forward. In the question of Hungary, that is a more difficult question. There is no doubt that Viktor Orban is a bloody pain. And you know, I've got every time I've come across him and his group, we have crossed swords with his group, and I think that he is deliberately taking a view that sanctions against Russia are inappropriate, and I do not agree with that. So that is a subject of considerable debate. I don't know how that's going to end up, because at the moment he has a substantial majority, and we will just have to look to the future for that.
Thank you. I think there's time for one last question. Liz, you have a question, I think. Liz Spencer.
Dominic, good evening. Yes, I do, John. I think you've recovered your chat feed, Dominic. Can I invite you to elaborate on your reference to ecocide? How can this be given effect, and does it require a new convention?
This is a question of ecocide, is it?
Yep.
Yeah. I have looked very carefully at the existing legislation, and we've worked very closely with the UN on this. And my view is that there are gaps in the legislation that do not allow us to proceed with a charge against the Russians for whether it's poisoning water for a village or letting off a small nuclear bomb or whatever. And I believe that there is an opportunity here for a new convention, and it was very encouraging that at the Council of Europe, and we're coming up to a big summit to look at the way forward, that the Icelandic presidents and I had a very useful chat, and she does want to take this forward. Now, I think that is very encouraging, because I do think that we should plug any gaps there, and it's not specifically for Russia and Ukraine. There are also examples between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, where that does involve supplies of water. But I do think that there is scope for this. The British government view is that existing legislation is fine, but having looked through it in a great deal of detail, and having discussed it in also a great deal of detail with the UN, I don't believe that is the case.
Thank you.
You're muted again.
We have come to 1 minute past 7, and I think we have dealt with all the questions which people had. I'm immensely grateful to you for having given up your time to come and talk to the CEF this evening. And I have to say, it's just very heartening to hear what you have to say, because to be blunt about it, for such a long time, actually getting Conservatives to speak strongly favourably to the council and the ECHR has been very difficult. Of course, they'll do it privately, but they haven't done it with the openness which you have been displaying this evening. And all I can say is it's very reassuring. What perhaps we didn't have as much time to discuss as we might is that the Council of Europe is, of course, more than the ECHR. You've hinted at it over the over ecocide and the Istanbul Convention, but of course it discusses lots of other cultural and link-up issues which cover Europe more generally, in which the UK can play a participatory and indeed a leading role. So for all those reasons, we wish you well. We hope very much that you continue in this role and continue to influence some of my former colleagues at Westminster and the Conservative Party who don't seem to understand the advantages of soft power which are conferred by having been an active and supportive participant in this organisation for a long time. And I hope you continue to enjoy Strasbourg, which apart from the presence of Russians, which I'm sure is extremely unpleasant, is actually a very lovely city, which it's always rather nice, in my experience, to go to. So thank you very much, John, on behalf of us all. That leaves me only that leaves me only with a little bit of housekeeping. Forthcoming events. 3rd of April, there's a webinar with Andy Street from 6 to 7 p.m. You'll be provided with details about that. There was going to be a meeting with Oliver Heald about his role on the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly. More details shortly. Anybody who is not a member of the CEF and is on this call, would you please consider joining? I think our numbers are growing. I'm feeling much more optimistic. And that remains only to thank Simon Saunders for the tech and getting this thing working, and thanking you again, John, for having agreed to join us and giving up your time for us this evening. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.